So this is continuing on with chapter 11, motivation and emotion, and now we're going to look at motivation and behavior. All right, so right now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, in terms of motivation and behaviors, we're going to look at hunger as well as eating and biological factors that involve. First and foremost, when we talk about the stomach, early hunger researchers, yes, there's researchers who have worked and studied on our ability to eat as well as be hungry. They believe that the stomach controls hunger, contracting to send hunger signals when it's empty. However, today we kind of know it's more complicated than just that. As dieters who drink lots of water to keep their stomachs feeling full have been disappointed to discover that the sensory input from an empty stomach is really not essential for feeling hungry. In fact, humans and non-human animals without stomachs, they still continue to experience that sense of hunger. However, there is a connection that's between the stomach and feeling hungry. There's receptors in our stomachs and intestines that kind of detect levels of nutrients, and that specialized pressure receptors in our stomach walls that'll signal feelings of emptiness or being sated, full or satiated. And the stomach, as well as other parts of the gastrointestinal tract, they're going to also release chemical signals that will play a role with our hunger. So we take a look at biochemistry. Now, the biochemistry, like the stomach, the brain, as well as other parts of our body, it produces numerous neurotransmitters, hormones, enzymes, as well as other chemicals that can affect hunger and satiety. Research in this area has been quite complex because the large number of known as well as unknown bodily chemicals and the interactions among them, it's kind of unlikely that any one chemical controls our hunger and eating. Other internal factors like thermogenesis, which is that heat generated within response to food ingestion, it also plays a role. The brain, in addition to its chemical signals, particularly with brain structures, can also influence hunger as well as eating. So let's look at the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, it helps regulate eating, drinking, as well as our body temperature. Now, some of the key mechanisms for hunger in terms of hunger regulation. Early research has suggested that one area of the brain, which is the hypothalamus, the lateral hypothalamus, or LH, as you want to shorten it, stimulates eating. Whereas in contrast, the ventromedial hypothalamus, VMH, here it's created feelings for satiation as well as signals the animal to stop eating. So when the lateral hypothalamus area was destroyed in rats through that research, through the study, the researchers were able to find that animals starved to death if they were not force-fed. When the VMH area was destroyed, pretty much they overate to the point of extreme obesity. Now, later research, however, kind of showed that the lateral hypothalamus as well as the VMH areas are not simple on and off switches for eating. An example being looking at lesions in the VMH kind of helped to show how animals can be picky eaters. They reject food that doesn't taste good. You've known that happened to you, I'm quite sure. I know I have. But these lesions, they also increase insulin secretion, which may cause overeating. So today, researchers, they kind of know that the hypothalamus really plays an important role in our hunger as well as eating. But it's not the brain's eating center. A matter of fact, hunger and eating, like virtually all behavior, is usually influenced by numerous neural circuitry that runs throughout the brain. All right. So, looking at the psychosocial factors, think about when you sit down at Thanksgiving time. You sit down to that turkey and everything else that's on that table during Thanksgiving, and you just might, you know, like to know there may soon be a way for us to fool our stomach into feeling like we ate a big meal so that, guess what, we don't eat that big meal. Well, there's also that research currently being done now in that particular area. Yet, internal motivations for hunger, we discussed earlier about our stomach and biochemistry and how the brain is involved. And that's really all powerful. But the psychosocial factors, like when we watched a Papa John's commercial on TV when Shaq is saying, yeah, go out and have one of these pizzas, and how it can be equally important stimulus cues for hunger as well as eating. Another important environmental influence on when, what, where, and why we eat is also through cultural conditioning. Here in America, for example, we tend to eat uh, usually in the evening around 6 p.m. Usually that's a North American thing. I myself am a late eater. But you may have people that's in Spain or South America, they might eat around 10 p.m., which maybe that's where I should be. But when it comes to what we eat, have you ever eaten a rat, a dog, or a horse for meat? I haven't. But if you're typically North American, this might really do sound repulsive to you, as it does for me. Yet most Hindus would feel a similar revulsion at the thought of eating meat from cows because of what the cow symbolizes to that culture. So we can't always, just chuck in, be negative in terms of how other cultures, what they eat and why. You'll have some people who eat uh, insects, for example. But it's what you've been around, what you've become accustomed to, and it's those type of psychosocial factors that would help to stimulate the desire for that particular food and whether or not it'll make you hungry. So let's talk a little bit about some of the eating disorders, and we'll probably be going over these again within the chapters discussing psychological disorders. But I do want to talk about it here in the sense of how we're motivated about eating and what might become abnormal. So, in terms of obesity, now this is something that has reached epidemic proportions here in the United States, particularly here in Mississippi, as we have unfortunately been usually between the top three contenders of most obese in America. Unfortunately, but true, we have rich palates. Well, over half of all adults for clinically obesity, and that's meaning they have a body weight mass of 15% or more uh, for their height or age. And then each year, billions of dollars are going to be spent treating serious and life-threatening medical problems that's related to obesity. And consumers spend billions more, largely, on ineffective weight loss products and services to try to get rid of the weight. For us, controlling weight has particularly become a difficult task. We're among the most sedentary people of all nations, and we've become accustomed to that supersized cheeseburger that we could get at McDonald's, or when we go to Sonic's and get those big gulp drinks, as well as huge servings of dessert when we go to Dairy Queen. We've learned that we should eat at least 3 times a day, whether we're hungry or not. And that tasty food requires lots of salt, sugar, as well as fat. And that food is an essential part of our social gatherings. However, we all know there's some people who can eat anything they want and they still not add any weight to their body. Their metabolism is like This can be a result to have that ability to burn those calories effectively through thermogenesis because of that higher metabolism, as well as other factors. Adoption and twin studies have been able to indicate that genes also play a huge role. Heritability for obesity can range between 30 to 70%. And I want you to make sure you heard that, 30 to 70%. You might see that as a question on an exam. But unfortunately, identifying genes for obesity is still quite difficult. Research has isolated over 2,000 genes that contribute to normal as well as abnormal weight. Now, many Americans have always usually used New Year's as a time to make resolutions to say they're going to eat less, exercise more, and they're going to drop those pounds. But people with anorexia nervosa, now these individuals, they do these things to such an extreme that it endangers their health or even their lives. So, and I'm trying to think of the name. It's on Netflix. I don't know if it's still present, but it's a movie that I say watch because it's on anorexia. And what I will do, because the name is not coming to me right now, I will try to look it up on Netflix. And if I can locate it, because I think I did save it, I will put the name on the page so that you can go see it for yourselves. But it was actually a great movie. But know that when we're talking about anorexia nervosa, they've done research on the brain through brain scans that revealed that women with anorexia may experience taste differently than others. And this is one of those stories in which we have on anorexia in terms of the brain, and there's a video about it that I'll try to bring up and put up as well. So now, anorexia nervosa, again, it's an eating disorder that's characterized by a severe loss of weight that's resulting from self-imposed starvation as well as an obsessive fear of obesity. Anorexia nervosa is where an individual has, no matter what, they can be as thin as 50, 60, 70 pounds, which adult women that suffers from anorexia nervosa, they've had several women that will fall that low in weight. But it's characterized by that severe loss of weight that results from that self-imposed starvation, the fear of obesity. They have this distortion of their body image, and they're constantly fighting for a need of control. It's where they see the food they won't want to eat. When they're forced to eat a spoonful, they'll feel it's too much. Of course, this is dangerous in terms of weight loss measures. Problems can result to extreme malnutrition, and they might wind up with emaciation, osteoporosis, bone fractures, interruption of their menstruation, as well as loss of brain tissue. A significant percentage of individuals with anorexia nervosa ultimately dies from this disorder. So it's an extremely serious disorder and actually quite hard to treat. Now, when we're talking about bulimia, this is characterized by the desire to eat and gorge the food, and then the person will try to regurgitate or take laxatives. Unlike anorexia, bulimia is characterized more by weight fluctuations within or above the normal range. So it's not as easily seen with a person who's suffering from bulimia. Okay, it's really easy for a person that has bulimia nervosa to hide it. Individuals with this disorder, they also show impulsivities in other areas of their lives. They may be excessive shoppers, substance abuse, petty shoplifting. The vomiting that's associated with both anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa really can cause erosion to the teeth, which leads to tooth loss. There'll be severe damage to one's throat as well as their stomach. They may experience cardiac arrhythmias, uh, metabolic deficiencies, as well as other digestive disorders. So just going over once again, I'm not going to read each and every one, but do take time. Of course, inside the module sections, you will have the PowerPoint slides that you can look at on your own. And here it gives you again some of the symptoms for the anorexia nervosa as well as bulimia nervosa. Now, there are many causes to anorexia nervosa as well as bulimia. And some of the theories focuses really on physical causes like the hypothalamic disorders or low levels of various neurotransmitters, genetic or hormonal disorders. And then there's other theories that would emphasize on the psychosocial factors like a need for perfection or that perceived loss of control, being bullied or teased about one's body weight, destructive thought patterns, and being in depression or dysfunctional families, having distorted body images, as well as sexual abuse. These are all factors that can be considered, and hence these social pressures for thinness certainly contributes to eating disorders like anorexia nervosa. Has also been found really in non-industrialized areas like within the Caribbean, um, and so forth. And being overweight is socially acceptable in some areas, and the average woman actually is considered heavier. Like if you go to some parts of Africa, if you are thin, you're considered malnourished. Your weight would also be connected to a class system in which the heavier you are, the more obese, then it's saying you're more rich, you're in more of the upper class. So these are some of the type of cultural issues that we can see. However, again, considerably heavier women on average in North America would not be seen in that same aspect. And there are going to be some women that would still have anorexia nervosa and might be overweight or be obese. It's the long term when you notice that major weight loss that you'll be able to reflect and see it. So now research suggests that both culture and biology actually can help us to explain eating disorders. Thus, they rely on the biopsychosocial model. Now this here is what we call storytelling. We're not going to get to practice this, but this is part of the thematic apperception test, in which we would go through and have a person tell us a story and allow us to be able to measure the story in terms of needs for achievement. We're not going to do that in the assignment today, but it's something that you may come across in time and time again. So this picture would be asking, and I might ask, for example, what's happening in the picture, what led up to it, who are the people in the picture, and how do they feel, and so forth. And we call this one of those subjective type of instruments that allows us to test needs for achievement. So when we talk about achievement motivation, do you wonder what motivates Olympic athletes, for an example? What makes them work so hard just for that gold medal? Or what about someone like Thomas Edison, who came up with over 1,000 different inventions? What drives some people to this high level of achievement? The key to understanding what motivates high achieving individuals really lies within what a psychologist named Henry Murray identified as high need for achievement or achievement motivation. Achievement orientation appears to be largely learned when we're young, in early childhood, and this primarily through the interactions of our parents or caregivers. Highly motivated children tend to have parents or caregivers who encourage independence and frequently would reward success. Our cultural values, it also affects achievement needs. Now, there's a preference for moderately difficult tasks. People high in needs of achievement avoid tasks that's going to be too easy because it offers very little challenges or any real satisfaction to them. They'll also avoid extremely difficult tasks because then the probability of them being successful will be really low. Okay, so they look more to be on the moderate end of things rather than too low, too easy, or too hard. Now, the second one would be competitiveness. High achievement oriented people are going to be more attracted to careers and tasks that would involve being competitive, and it'll provide an opportunity for them to excel in whatever that area is. Then there's the preference for clear goals with competent feedback. High achievement people, they're going to look and prefer tasks that has clear outcomes as well as situations in which they can receive feedback on their performances. They'll also prefer critiques that's harsh but competent evaluators to criticism from one who's friendlier but less competent. So a great example I have of that is when I was in grad school, I had one instructor that I had to take several courses from. She taught therapy courses. She taught individual therapy as well as group therapy. When I took her for individual therapy, she really beat me down, and I walked away with a B in that class. It propelled me to work even harder so that when I took her group therapy course, she was just as rigorous, just as rough, and just as strict, and extremely harsh, but I was able to walk away with an A. She continued to motivate me to where I decided to make her the chair of my dissertation because I wanted that challenge. So that's where you would have and expect that high need for achievement. That motivation comes in that goal. Her being harsh and hard, it just pushed me to want to do better. The next one, the fourth one, will be responsibility. Now, people with high needs of achievement here, they prefer personally responsible for projects so that they can feel satisfied when the task is well done. Get credit where the credit's due. If I did great, I want to know I did great. So I want to take the challenge on. They're also going to be persistent. Okay. High achievement individuals more likely will stay on task when it becomes difficult. There was one study in which 47% of high needs achievement individuals persisted on unsolvable type tasks until time was called, compared to only 2% of people who was considered low needs of achievement. Then there's being more accomplished. People who have high needs of achievement scores do better than others on exams. They earn better grades in school. They'll excel within their chosen professions, and so on. So those are 6 characteristics of individuals who usually would be considered high needs of achievement. Sexuality. Now, in this area, it's obvious that there's a strong motivation to engage in sexual behavior. Let's face it, we're all adults. But it's essential for the survival of our species as well. We also like the pleasure of it. But sexuality includes much more than just the reproduction process. For us, as well as some animals, a sexual relationship fulfills many different needs, and it includes the need for being connected to someone, having intimacy, feeling pleasure, as well as the release of that sexual tension that we get. Now, this is something that I would just like for you to do for yourself. And it will not be where you have to give me some big, deep answers to these questions. It's more for yourself, and I will try my best to make sure it's removed from the assignment so you don't have to write about it. But I want you to just think about it. Look at the questions, and then just to yourself discuss what you feel they are. Have you been able to discuss sexual intercourse with your grandmother or grandfather? If you're a parent, were you able to discuss sexual intercourse with your children? Have you discussed sexual intercourse with a sibling? And was it easy or hard? Think about those different kind of questions and being able to ask questions about sex. This is where a lot of people actually struggle and actually have difficulty in talking freely about sex. I can tell you that my mother never taught me anything about sex at all. She could not discuss it. She, when growing up and I was still in grade school and I was experiencing someone start their menstrual cycle and they had a huge accident in a cafeteria, I went home and because I heard somebody say, well, oh, she just got her period. And I went home and I asked my mother about it, and I said, Mom, what is a period? And she told me a period is that time between classes. So that's an example, and I know that could have been a TMI for some of you, and hopefully I didn't offend you by sharing that. But again, speaking about sex is part of life, so I don't have any qualms about sharing that experience. But in talking about the reproductive process, my mother couldn't even give me that information. Thankfully, I had aunts who didn't mind telling me so that when the time came for me to have started that cycle of life, it didn't scare me. But when asking questions about sex, ask yourself, how hard would it be for you? So I know you didn't think we were going to be just done with sex already. Of course, we have to talk about our sexual response cycles. William Masters and Virginia Johnson back in 1966 were the first to start conducting lab studies on what happens to the human body during the sexual activities. And pretty much what they did was they attached recording devices to male and female volunteers and monitored or filmed their physical responses as they moved from non-arousal to orgasm and then back to non-arousal. And what they did was label the bodily changes during the series of events of a sexual response cycle. Now, researchers have further characterized differences between sexual response patterns and men and women, and you can kind of get a picture of it here on the here on the slide. So the sexual response cycle that Masters and Johnson's description is basically a four-stage bodily response to sexual arousal. And it consists of excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. Okay? So the excitement phase, you think about it as the foreplay time. People's just starting to get excited. Opposite or same sex, it doesn't matter. Your body is just speaking to you. And during that plateau phase, this is when that physiological as well as sexual arousal start to continue and it's starting to heighten up. For men, an erection will start to develop where Women, the vagina is the vaginal area is going to expand and ready to take in. So it moves on now. The act has begun between two people who are sexually active, and then moving toward that orgasm phase. This is usually involving really intense release of tension, and an orgasm occurs. Now, although we have an overall pattern of sexual responses similar for both sexes, there is more variation, though, in specific patterns among women. The first off being immediately after an orgasm, men generally have to enter a refractory period, and it lasts from several minutes, or it can be all the way up to a day, depending on that person. Whereas with the female sexual response, it's generally followed by one or more of three basic patterns. Okay, a female response would be moving from the orgasm to the plateau, and they kind of have a quicker response to getting back from it. Okay, where females can actually experience several orgasms repeatedly back to back. Okay, all right. So now, I'm sorry, one moment. There we go. In terms of sexual orientation, what leads some people to be homosexual and for others to be heterosexual? Unfortunately, the root of sexual orientations is generally poorly understood. There has been, however, studies that suggest that genetics in biology plays a huge role in one's sexual orientation. Studies on identical and fraternal twins, as well as adopted siblings, have found that if one identical twin was gay, then 48 to 65% of the time, so was the second twin. Now, understand that if this cause was totally genetic, then that percentage would be 100%. So we know that it's not all genetics, but the rate was 26 to 30% for fraternal twins, and then 6 to 11% for just siblings, brothers and sisters who may have been adopted into one's family. Estimates of homosexuality in the general population would run between approximately 2 to 10%. Now, although mental health authorities years passed long ago and they discontinued labeling homosexuality as a mental illness, because unfortunately they did consider it to be a mental illness, there still continues to be this divisive societal issue in terms of the LGBTQ community. Gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people are often confronted with sexual prejudice. They endure verbal and physical attacks, experience disrupted family and peer relationships, as well as have high rates of anxiety, depression, as well as suicidal ideations and attempts, unfortunately. Sexual prejudice is really a socially reinforced phenomenon, not an individual pathology, as which older term that was used as homophobia implied. We now know it's more about sexual prejudice. Alright, so now let's talk about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. Now, with extrinsic motivation is based on external rewards or threats of punishment. Intrinsic motivation is that motivation that's resulting from internal personal satisfaction from a task or activity. Should parents reward children for getting good grades? there's a lot of different thoughts about this. Many psychologists, they're concerned about the widespread practice of always giving external or extrinsic rewards to help motivate one's behavior. Because the concern would be that providing always giving extrinsic motivation can seriously affect the individual's personal intrinsic motivation. If you're constantly always going to wait for somebody to give you something, then there's not going to be that inner drive within you to want to participate and do things. It'll be hard to get someone to play in sports unless they felt that they were going to get a reward after. Not the satisfaction of like learning how to swim for themselves, or being able to play a guitar, or learning how to dance. Those are the type of things that's generally intrinsic motivation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of different students as well as workers that's going to school or going to work that is extrinsically motivated. Now, extrinsic motivation for work is what? Getting paid. But what happens to trying to get an intrinsic motivation for a career or job? Just being satisfied that you did a job well done. Sometimes it gets lost within the two realms. Because when we perform a task for no ulterior motive or purpose, we know that if we do it because we like it, that's what intrinsically being motivated is. And just remember, in contrast, we're extrinsically motivated by rewards like praise or payment like when we get paid from our job. And there are some types of extrinsic rewards that actually decrease our level of enjoyment as well as hamper our performances. Now, researchers have found that a group of preschoolers, for example, spent more time drawing when they were intrinsically motivated, meaning no reward, than when they were either promised an extrinsic reward or were given an unexpected reward when they were done. Another thing to look at is that if extrinsic rewards are used to control or gain approval, like when parents give children approval or privileges for achieving good grades, it often decreases motivation for them to do it on their own. Third thing to remember is extrinsic rewards can be motivating if they are used to produce intrinsic motivation. One way to see it is when we look at superior performances recognized with a reward or a special no string attached type thing. It allows one to increase their level of enjoyment. So now we're going to take a look at components and theories of emotion, those being biological, cognitive, and behavioral. Now the three components of emotional, first starting off with the biological, we know that our emotional experiences appear to result from important interactions between several areas of the brain, most particularly the cerebral cortex and the limbic system. And as we saw earlier on in chapter 2, we know that the cerebral cortex is that outermost layer of the brain, and it serves our body's ultimate control and information processing center. That includes our ability to be able to recognize as well as regulate our emotions. Now that limbic system in the brain is also essential to our emotions. Think of it like this. Several studies have been able to show that one area of the limbic system, the amygdala, plays a key role with our emotions, particularly when we talk about fear. It sends signals to the other areas of our brains that help to increase the heart rate or other physiological reactions that's related to fear. Remember, we talked about fight or flight. Interesting enough, emotional arousal sometimes occurs without even having conscious awareness. Joseph Ledoux, who was a psychologist, he saw that sensory inputs arrived in the thalamus, which you have to remember, we consider this to be our sensory switchboard. It sends separate messages up to the cortex which this allows the thinking to happen, and that's the stimulus. And then the amygdala, which helps to activate that body's alarm system. So although this dual pathway occasionally will lead to false alarms, it does happen from time to time, such as we might see a stick and think it's a snake. Ledoux felt that this highly adaptive warning system is actually truly essential for our survival. He stated that the time saved by the amygdala in acting on that thalamic interpretation, rather than waiting for that cortical input, can actually be the difference between life and death, because you at least got yourself prepared even though it was a stick. Imagine if it was still, you didn't give any thought to it, and it did turn out to be a snake and you got too close. Guess what? You just got bit. So that's what Ledoux is talking about there. All right. So as important as the brain is to emotion, it is the autonomic nervous system. And again, we learned about that earlier on in chapter 2, that help to produce obvious signs of arousal. These largely automatic responses results from interconnections as between the autonomic nervous system as well as various glands and muscles. Now, during emotional arousal, our sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is going to do what I talked about in the last slide, fight or flight. That's where the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine will keep the system under the sympathetic control until the emergency is considered over. Now, our parasympathetic branch, this is what helps us get back to homeostasis, that more relaxed state. Two more components of emotion to look at, that being cognitive and behavioral. Now you see the man here, you can see he's smiling. I want to ask you, which one looks more sincere to you? Would it be picture A or picture B? And tell me, why do you think it's more sincere? Well, you can't tell me per se, and I'm not going to put in an assignment, but ask yourself why. Why do you see it being more sincere? What I'm going to talk about right now is what we call the Duchenne smile. Now, to most people, the smile on the left really looks more sincere than the one on the right. A is what we consider that false social smile, and be pretentious somewhat, where our voluntary cheek muscles are going to be pulled back, our eyes are going to be unsmiling. The B photo, this is when you see true pleasure in someone. Muscles are not going to be around the cheeks or the eyes. It's not going to be false. It's going to be more relaxed. So according to Duchenne, Boulogne, muscle, the eye muscle does not really obey the will. And I'm sorry, one moment. Let me see if I can turn off this little thing. There we go. It keeps flying around. All right. But as I was mentioning, it's not going to really obey or go at will. It's going to be that natural reaction that happens. Studies find that people who show a Duchenne or real smile and laughter can elicit more positive responses from strangers, as well as enjoy better interpersonal relationships and personal adjustment. All right, take a moment and write down a phrase, and then what I want you to do is, whoever's in your home with you, get a volunteer. Your goal is going to be to see if they understand what you are saying non-verbally and what emotion would be accompanied with it. So you would use the following. In an angry manner, have them try to pass you the salt, but with you being angry. Okay? And don't be too overly angry. Just, attempt to portray these different tasks with those kind of emotions. With the emotion of embarrassment, try to say, shh, don't tell that story. With guilt, try to say you paid the bill. And then one more. Can you give me some money? And say it with fear. See if they can catch the different emotions that you're playing. Don't tell them the emotions you're doing, but just tell them you're going to play these different sentences out, and you can even come up with more of your own, and see if they can guess which emotions you are portraying with those different sentences. All right. Now, there's three major theories when we talk about emotions. Imagine you're walking in the woods and suddenly you see that snake on the path. Remember, we thought it was a snake, a stick, but it turns out to be a snake. What emotion would you experience? Most people would say that they're really scared or afraid. But then the question has to come up to you as, why would they say that? Now, common sense tells us that our hearts are pounding and we might be trembling, that then we're afraid, or that when we cry, that we're sad. But according to the James Lange theory, felt emotions result from physiological arousal of the autonomic nervous system. This arousal, that pounding heart, being breathless, trembling, this causes us to experience the emotion that we call fear, according to the James Lange theory. Now, contrary to popular opinion, James wrote that we feel sorry because we're crying. We're angry because we had struck out at something. We're afraid because we are trembling right now. Now, on the other side of this coin, we have the Cannon-Barr theory. And they propose that arousal and emotion actually occur separately, but simultaneously, if you could figure that one out. Separately, but simultaneously. So what they're saying is, following the perception of an emotion-provoking stimulus, the thalamus, which is that subcortical brain structure, is going to send two simultaneous messages at the same time. One to your autonomic nervous system, which is going to cause a physiological arousal, and then one to your brain's cortex, cerebral cortex, and that is going to cause awareness of the felt emotion. There's still one more theory we got to talk about, and that's Schachter and Singer's two-factor theory. Now, this theory suggests that our emotions actually start with a physiological arousal that's going to be followed by a conscious cognitive appraisal. Meaning that when we look to external cues from the environment and to others around us to find a label and an explanation for that arousal that we're feeling. Therefore, if we cry at a wedding, for example, pretty much the label our emotion is going to be as joy or happiness. But if we were at a funeral and we cry, then we will see that emotion and label it as sadness. Okay? Now, facial feedback hypothesis. Research on emotion has been able to support or discounted parts of all three of those major theories and added some additional ideas. And we talked earlier about behavioral component of emotion, facial expressions like the Duchenne smile. It helped us to be able to express our emotions, right? So now, according to the facial feedback hypothesis, movements of our facial muscles produce and or intensify our subjective experience of emotion, as we can see in the picture below on the slide. Specifically speaking, when we're talking about that sensory input, if you saw that snake, it's that first routed subcortical areas of the brains that's going to activate facial movements. And these facial changes then will initiate and intensify the emotion we're having. Now, this is just something to help you in terms of preparing yourself, because eventually we will be having an exam on the area. You will find this slide within the PowerPoint slides in your module, and be sure to test yourself. Make sure you got a good understanding of it. All right. Now, given the seemingly vast array of emotions within our own culture, it could be a surprise for you to learn that some researchers believe all of our feelings can be condensed into at least 7 to 10 culturally universal emotions. Now, note that the strong similarities among the 4 lists on the table that you see on the slide. People from very different cultures is going to display remarkably similar facial expressions when experiencing particular emotions. Furthermore, people everywhere can reliably identify at least 6 basic emotions, that being happiness, surprise, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. So in terms of culture, evolution, and emotion, those cultural differences, so how do we explain cultural differences with our emotions? Although we all seem to share similar facial expressions for some emotions, each culture has its own display rules governing how and when and where those emotions will be used. Okay? So if we take, for instance, parents might pass along their culture-specific display rules when they are responding angrily to some emotions with their children, when they're sympathetic to others, or when they simply ignore an expression of emotion at all. Public physical contact is also going to be governed by the display rules. Here in the U.S., as well in Asian countries, they're less likely than people in other cultures to touch each other. Like, I'm a native New Yorker, okay? And one of the things you wouldn't do is automatically come up and give a person a hug on the street if you don't know them. Whereas when I first moved here to Mississippi, that Southern charm, it was where I had to get used to it, because I actually had someone come up and say, "Hey, hello," and give me a hug. And I was like, "Oh, wait a minute." That's what I'm talking about, a cultural difference, okay? Role of evolution is suggesting that our basic emotions will evolve before we think about it. How our thought processes are is going to be different than what we show in our terms of emotion. And just remember that facial expressions, there is some universality, but doesn't necessarily mean that everybody uses it in the same context in the same way. That's why sometimes it's still important to ask questions. All right, so here's a fun question. I think you might have seen it in terms of Mythbusters in your textbook. I didn't put it in the slides this time around, but a question was asking about, does a polygraph actually work? Can we use a polygraph as a lie detector? Now, you need to note that the GSR arises sharply in responses to a question. Have you ever taken money from this bank? Or have you ever seen someone drop $10 and you picked it up and didn't give it back? Our bodies react to those different situations. So now, traditional polygraph tests, they're based on the theory that when people lie, they're going to feel guilty about it or anxious. And then there's going to be these special sensors that supposedly will detect these testable emotions by being able to measure the sympathetic as well as parasympathetic nervous system responses. Now, the problem is that lying is only loosely going to be related to one's anxiety or guilt. There are some individuals who can become nervous even when they're telling the truth, whereas you have some who can lie deliberately and never shed this piece of sweat. They could just say it cool, calm, and collectedly. That polygraph cannot tell which emotion is going to be felt, of one being nervous or it's excited, if they have sexual arousal, or so forth, or whether a response is going to be due to that emotional arousal or something else. Now, there's been a study that found that people could actually affect the outcome of a polygraph by about 50%, simply by pressing, say for example, they take a tack, they can step on that tack and it's going to elicit some different type of emotions that way, or biting down on their tongue. So we've discovered that polygraphs are not 100%. There have been those who stated that 90% accuracy could be better than nothing, or that actual tests would show error rates that can range between 25 and 75%. This is the reason why, although it's still used widely, it'll never be utilized in a court of law because it cannot be considered that accurate. All right, so we are at the end of chapter 11, and please make sure that you do the assignment that comes below it. Thanks.